what we should be aiming for, it seems that bliss, happiness, and motivation are dissociable, and that we can ratchet up bliss, we can ratchet up motivation too, but we're going to be able to choose what level of motivation and what level of bliss we have. It's possible to imagine a future civilization of lotus eaters who are blissful, but they're not motivated to do anything. But we can also imagine a future civilization of humans, transhumans, who are blissful, but they are also hyper-motivated to an extent that we can't even imagine. It's true that suffering can be instructive, both in the arts and in the rest of life. But the question to ask is not whether suffering, negative experience can sometimes be instructive. The question to ask is whether it is computationally, functionally indispensable. And generative AI shows that it isn't.
David Pearce, welcome to the show. I would love it if we could start with your journey. What's the journey that you've been on that's brought you to where you are today and the work that you do?
Good heavens. Well, I've always been, as long as I can remember, obsessed by the problem of suffering. It's a very ancient problem, but genome reform is a game changer. And in 1995, I wrote an online manifesto, the Hedonistic Imperative, which essentially calls for the use of genetic engineering to fix the problem of suffering and to replace the traditional pleasure-pain axis with, so to speak, a pleasure-super-pleasure axis. And I advocate a living world underpinned by gradients of intelligent bliss. And back in 1998, I set up with Nick Bostrom the World Transhumanist Association. Transhumanists hope to create, crudely speaking, a triple S civilization of super longevity, super intelligence, and super happiness, the three supers. My own focus, though, has very much been on suffering, fixing the problem of suffering. Everything else, ultimately, I regard as akin to rearranging the deck chairs.
And why do you think you focused in on that? What's your own experience of suffering been?
Yes, personally, psychological pain, mental pain has loomed larger in my life than physical pain, though physical pain can be absolutely horrific. It is predominantly psychological pain that causes some 800,000 people worldwide to take their own lives each year. Anyone who isn't disturbed by severe suffering simply hasn't understood it. And somehow I try to get the balance right, that if I just talk about all the pain and the suffering in the world, people switch off. So I try to balance the awful stuff with a vision of paradise, because if we are prepared to edit our genetic source code, we can create a sublime future. We can create, yes, indescribable paradise. So yeah, I try to get the balance right, which is hard.
You've been talking about this since the 90s, I believe.
Yes, it's 3 decades now since I wrote the Hedonistic Imperative. Back in 1995, cultured meat was sci-fi. The human genome hadn't been decoded, and CRISPR-based synthetic gene drives that cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance were pretty much inconceivable. But yes, over the past 3 decades, I have banged the drum for this particular vision of paradise. Obviously, it's got many historical antecedents. One thinks of Buddhism, Buddha's apocryphal quote, I teach one thing and one thing, suffering and the end of suffering. may all that have life be delivered from suffering. One can allude to the the book of Isaiah, the Christian Bible, a veganized living world in which the lion and the wolf lie down with the lamb. But these visions are very utopian. They don't go into technical details. And a lot of my work has focused on actual blueprints, technical blueprints, showing how it is possible if we tweak even a handful of genes, offer all prospective parents access to pre-implantation genetic screening, counseling, genome editing, how we can get rid of the horrors of factory farming and replace them by cultured meat and farm-free animal products, how we can use synthetic gene drives to herbivorize predators, cross-species fertilization, hedonic uplift. Obviously, a lot of these technical blueprints, they're never going to be dusted down, but until we actually have an understanding of what is technically feasible, we can't have a serious ethical debate about the long-term future of sentience. Essentially, the level of suffering in the living world is going to become an adjustable parameter, and as a species, we're going to need to decide how much suffering, if any, we want to exist in the biosphere.
You mentioned there a few of the things that have changed since you first started your work. Could you give us a bit more of an in-depth tour of how the space has progressed over the last 30 years or so, and has it surprised you?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. Let's start with the depressing stuff. We still don't have an analog of Huxley's Soma. Remember, Soma in Brave New World was supposedly an ideal pleasure drug. In fact, it wasn't really an ideal pleasure drug. Huxley was aiming to in some ways, Huxley's utopia was a dystopia. But nonetheless, I would love to tell you that today there is a wonder drug that would fix suffering. It doesn't yet exist. In other ways, I have been, like everyone else, completely blindsided by recent progress in artificial intelligence. The transformer revolution in AI, leading to, ChatGPT, Grok, Gemini, DeepSeek, essentially Claude. Essentially, generative AI blows my mind. And what we're seeing today, essentially now, generative AI can produce answers on virtually any topic that is superior to almost all humans. And this isn't AI as we used to understand it. And if we use the tools of AI to essentially help us design better drugs, to design better genes, this will be absolutely awesome.
I would imagine the last few years, the last 3 or 4 years, you must have been sat up in your chair watching all these things develop.
Yes, essentially, it is not AI as we used to understand it. I used to, the notion of a classical Turing machine, and I was familiar with neural nets, yet generative AI blows my mind. I should add that unlike some futurists, I don't think classical digital computers can support phenomenally bound subjects of experience or minds. Essentially, our AIs are zombies, but these are zombies that are increasingly outperforming humans in ever more cognitive domains. Now, I suspect that an inability to access the empirical realm of mind and consciousness does actually impose cognitive blind spots. For instance, it's hard to imagine digital zombies. How on earth can they explore alien realms of psychedelia? But nonetheless, yes, it is jaw-dropping progress. For example, and this really blows my mind, AI can now speak more authoritatively about consciousness, the hard problem, the binding problem, the problem of causal efficacy, than almost all humans. And that's incredibly disconcerting. But in terms of the abolitionist project, paradise engineering, I very much hope that we'll be able to use AI to help us fix the problem of suffering. For example, although I focus on genome reform and spreading benign genes, benign alleles across the biosphere with synthetic gene drives, every cubic meter, every cubic millimeter of the planet is going to be is going to be accessible to surveillance, micromanagement, and control with ubiquitous super intelligent AI. How is it going to be used? Now, I very much hope that we can create a pan-species welfare state, what I sometimes call high-tech Jainism. Of course, much darker dystopian visions are possible too, a kind of global panopticon. So yes, we live in interesting times.
If you were to be consulted by world leaders, what advice would you offer them to implement this correctly and not end up in this, dystopian kind of vision?
The greatest source of severe and readily avoidable suffering in the world today is animal agriculture, factory farming. So before going on to detailed uh, implementation of the kind of vision I have in mind, we need to end animal agriculture. And the most realistic way we can do this is accelerate the development, commercialization of cultured meat, farm-free animal products. I should stress cultured meat needn't be genetically engineered. Some people are worried about frankenfoods. Cultured meat genetically identical to the meat of factory farmed non-human animals. And once we can switch the great majority of the population to cultured meat, essentially we can get, slaughterhouses should be outlawed and the surviving victims of factory farming rehabilitated. Next advice to world leaders would be offering all prospective parents worldwide, access to pre-implantation genetic screening, counseling, genome editing. Maybe even less than a dozen, maybe only half a dozen genetic tweaks could essentially defang the problem of the problem of suffering. I sometimes give the example. Please forgive me while I drink some Red Bull. The SCN9A gene, the volume knob for pain. Nonsense mutations induce congenital insensitivity to pain. Unfortunately, yes, they also abolish nociception. But if prospective parents are prepared to choose a benign version of SCN9A, they can give their kid an extremely high pain threshold, turn pain into what's, just a useful signaling mechanism, as some people with a very high pain threshold describe it. And with a few other tweaks of the genes involved, the opioid system, the FAR gene, the COMT gene, with a few genetic tweaks, we can ratchet up hedonic set points and essentially to increase the default quality of life of all new sentient beings. I stress, one presumably will start with humans, but it is going to be possible to do exactly the same throughout the animal kingdom.
Mm. And hedonic set point, could you just explain a little bit more about that?
Yes. It's the so-called lottery paradox that six months after either winning the lottery or having a terrible accident that leaves you quadriplegic, most people will revert to their previous level of well-being or ill-being. Essentially, the hedonic treadmill is the set of negative feedback mechanisms in the CNS that stops most of us being very sad or very happy for long. I mean, there's just no evidence that on average, humans today are either happier or unhappier than our ancestors on the African savannah. Which is a bit of a paradox if you think of it, that centuries of scientific and medical progress, socioeconomic reform, massive growth of GNP, and yet on average, our default well-being isn't significantly higher. The only way that we can ratchet up default quality of life is to tackle the negative feedback mechanisms of the hedonic treadmill. And we know, well, it was known from twin studies of fraternal and identical twins that hedonic set point had a high degree of genetic loading. We are starting to tease out the mechanisms behind essentially hedonic set points. Some people tragically are cursed with a low hedonic set point. High functioning depressives, for example, they go through life animated by gradients of ill being, whereas lucky hypothymic people bounce through life essentially animated by gradients of well being. And I think we want to create a hypothymic civilization of people with extremely high hedonic set points. Beyond that, well, the sky is the limit. Once we actually understand the molecular basis of pleasure in the CNS and the nature of phenomenal binding, it'll be possible to ratchet up hedonic range, hedonic set points, and to create, goodness knows, post-human civilization animated by gradients of superhuman bliss. I mean, this sounds like sci-fi, but anything we can imagine now is probably quite tame for what's in store. But from a purely ethical perspective, I think we ought to be focusing on the problem of suffering.
Has there been any examples of this in terms of the use of CRISPR or gene editing where this has actually taken place?
Well, a few years ago in China, we saw the advent of the first CRISPR babies. Unfortunately, the revolution was still born. The scientist in question uh, was he was probably really trying to create smart babies. I mean, the cover story was HIV protection, but in so-called animal models, the particular mutation in question actually increases cognitive performance. The Chinese Communist Party wobbled, and the scientist in question was disavowed. And so, in one sense, the revolution was still born. But we're already seeing in the United States now embryo screening for embryos essentially with high IQs. I think we need to see a happy baby company. Um, Embryo screening is not the same as CRISPR genome editing. I mean, I think essentially, yeah, we need to edit our genetic source code, but we are starting to see what I think in the long run is going to be a reproductive revolution. Whereas natural selection has been an engine of suffering on an almost unimaginable scale, unnatural selection involving conscious agents choosing the genetic makeup of their offspring in anticipation of the likely outcome of their choices, both psychologically and behaviorally. This is a different form of selection pressure. And I anticipate that eventually prospective parents will want to choose happier and happier offspring. After all, if you could choose the dial settings of your future children, what dial settings would you choose if you could choose the approximate hedonic range and hedonic set point of your future children? Now, clearly, this is speculative. It is possible that parents worldwide will continue to want to have offspring in the traditional way, but if this is the case, then the problem of suffering is insoluble. Whereas if we're willing to actually seize control of our genetic source code. After all children born today are unique, untested genetic experiments. And I think that anyone who believes that it is ethically permissible to create new life and today involuntary suffering has an obligation to load the genetic dice in favor of their future children.
Do you know, it's interesting that we're having this conversation today, because I was speaking to someone at an engagement party at the weekend, and I was asking this person if they were considering having kids. And they'd said that they did, that they were considering having kids, and that sort of surprised me, because I think this person in the past hadn't had much interest. And I said, and he mentioned this thing. He said, "Oh, it's not in that, egotistical kind of I want my genes to carry on way that a lot of people have children with." And then sort of my counter to that was, I think, I'd be lying if I didn't if I didn't admit that my reasons were kind of that I did want my own children, just from an instinctual whatever whatever lens you want to put it through. And I said, there's this argument, isn't there, that the world is a scary place, and why would you want to bring a child into this world, and there's all this suffering and stuff. And I thought to myself, and when I really thought about what my experience has been like being on Earth at that time, I did think to myself, it does feel a bit like it's all been suffering, and even if I would still want to be born, but it's interesting. It was the first time I've ever really thought of it like that. Like, overall, what has my experience been like? And what is it? The Buddha says life is suffering. So it's just interesting that we're having this conversation now, because I sometimes think, okay, would I have preferred to come into this world with a little bit of that bit taken out?
Yes. Yeah.
What about the nature versus nurture argument? So you could say, well, I'll take that gene away from you, which means you're more likely to become an alcoholic or whatever, and yet you get raised in a household with alcoholic parents or something along those lines.
Well, at times I speak like a crude genetic determinist, whereas in practice, as you were alluding to, the nature versus nurture debate, genes and culture co-evolved. And I in no way want to downplay the importance of, creating an ideal environment for children, socioeconomic reform, universal basic income, access to health care. I, like many people, have 1,001 nostrums for a better society. I would simply stress that unless we actually tackle the biological genetic roots of the problem, then suffering will proliferate indefinitely. Now, some people who, suffering focused ethics, who really take suffering seriously, take the hard antinatalist positions, Atheism or Benetarism. I mean, David Benatar wrote this book, Better Never to Have Been. If we are serious about fixing the problem of suffering, wouldn't it be best if we simply stopped having children? Now, although I can sympathize with this view, it doesn't work. Essentially, not having children just imposes a degree of selection pressure against any predisposition to stay child free, that the future belongs to life lovers. And so, as I said, although I can really respect the negative utilitarians, the Benetarians, the ethicists who say that, look, stop this grotesque engine of suffering, that Darwinian life churning out suffering, suffering, and more suffering. The future belongs to people who love life. And there are people, as I said, who don't regard life as suffering, who actually regard life as fun. And evolution bribes us with pleasure, not least offspring are conceived in intense sexual ecstasy. And many people, yes, derive a great deal of pleasure from life. But if one is creating children today without actually editing our genetic source code, one is inevitably creating a great deal of suffering without the prior consent of the victim. So, yes, my aim is strategically to hope that we can work with life lovers to fix suffering, just as in the case of the introduction of pain-free surgery in the 19th century. There didn't need to be an agreement between classical and negative utilitarians or virtue theorists or deontologists or religious people that pain-free surgery was good. I hope it will be possible to build a broad global consensus in favor of pain-free life, of life animated by information-sensitive gradients of well-being. Now, all this information-sensitive gradients of well-being is a bit of a mouthful, but it's really important because we're not talking about getting indiscriminately blissed out. It's really important to retain the signaling function of the pleasure-pain axis, or in future, the pleasure-super-pleasure axis. And one of the many beauties of hedonic recalibration, of ratcheting up your hedonic set point, is that in theory, at any rate, it's possible to conserve your existing preferences, your values, your relationships. Essentially, it's not asking you to buy into my conception of paradise. It just guarantees you a much higher default quality of life. And yeah, and crudely, the difference is between being blissful and blissed out. And it's possible to imagine information signaling even in post-human paradise, that even though, as I anticipate, tomorrow's hedonic floor will surpass our hedonic ceiling, you can still have information-sensitive gradients of well-being. Now, some people find this very counterintuitive, that even though today there are some people, tragically, who go through life animated by gradients of ill-being. Many people find it almost conceptually impossible to imagine going through life just animated by gradients of well-being. And by way of example, I sometimes, despite being a lifelong celibate, I talk of lovemaking. Lovemaking, if done properly, is generically pleasurable throughout. It has peaks and troughs. And yes, the dips are functionally analogous to suffering, but nonetheless, generic pleasure. And I would hope that in future, this is going to be possible for everyone throughout life.
It's interesting. If you think about, I would imagine you may have an idea of the amount of people, certainly in the West, that are taking SSRIs, beta blockers, any form of pharmacological intervention for their mental health, you have a full subset of people there who, in theory, should agree with the principle, because if they are taking medication now to, and are considering having children, then it's kind of, obviously there is this nature nurture thing, and perhaps the medication will make them, better parents than their parents were, or whatever. But in theory, it would suggest that, well, okay, so right now so if you're going to assume that your child was going to have to take SSRIs when they came into the world, wouldn't you want to just stop that in its tracks sooner? I think, as I've taken antidepressants before in my life. I don't anymore. But I do find it kind of frustrating that if anyone has experienced like low mood or depression, life is pretty good, but that around the corner you're gonna get a little bit of a dip. And I suppose to not have to just be a little bit more hopeful that the what is it, the blissful experience of life could be a little bit more stable, but without having that pharmacological intervention.
Yes, much better to create life that is naturally blissful, that is animated by gradients of well-being, rather than creating life that is prone to suffering, sometimes terrible suffering, and treating it with drugs. Unfortunately, existing drugs are woefully inadequate. Well, that's too strong, but only around half of people with clinical or subclinical depression are helped by existing drugs. I mean, one of the reasons may well be that the neurotransmitter system most implicated in hedonic tone is the opioid system. And mu opioids, really, they are antidepressants. The trouble is they're antidepressants with unacceptable side effects. Tolerance rapidly sets in. They tend to lead to emotional self-sufficiency, which impairs social bonding. Essentially, it would be much better if we were to ratchet up hedonic range and hedonic set points via genetic means.
So what's stopping us from this vision that you have, or what's stopping us from entering this?
Well, a lot of people will invoke the E word, eugenics. They will ask, well, I'm talking about genome reform. Aren't you really arguing eugenics? And one thinks back to the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, what started off with good intentions led to the horrors of Nazi Germany, the euthanasia program, ultimately the Holocaust. And so what do I say when someone says, are you advocating eugenics? I mean, clearly a commitment to the well-being of all sentients was not one of the tenets of National Socialism. And personally, I'm a woke lefty liberal, but the very term eugenics, although we do see, I mean, what linguists call it linguistic reappropriation, although various derogatory terms for black people and for gay people, they've been rehabilitated. The E word is, essentially probably, the E word is damned forever. But needless to say, although I might use the term genome reform, critics are not going to be so kind.
So there's a few terms there. So we've got genome reform, genome editing and eugenics. What are those three definitions? Could you just explain?
Yeah, I mean, eugenics, literally good genes. And clearly, I am urging us to edit out genes that predispose to depression, anxiety disorders, nasty pain syndromes, and tweak our genomes. Well, starting off with tweaking, then genetically editing our genomes so that life is animated exclusively by gradients of well-being. But as I was saying, any student of history knows that good intentions can go horribly wrong. And I don't want to end up as a mere propagandist. We need to, if we do take seriously the idea that we can create a happy, blissful biosphere and get rid of all experience below hedonic zero, we need to explore all the possible ways that things can go wrong. Now, we can't explore them all, but in the case of, for example, I talk of creating a blissful biosphere, but before phasing out predation in nature, via herbivorization, cross-species fertility regulation, and so forth. One would start with pilot studies in artificial, blissful biospheres. Now, in the case of humans, it's not possible to conduct these kinds of, well, one can do trial studies with happy babies, but essentially, we are weighing risk reward ratios that, given that all children born today, unique, untested genetic experiments, are we going to actually be prepared to load the genetic dice in favor of our kids? Or are we going to just trust God or, a genetic crapshoot?
So, what about the pushback on these points? So, what about, for instance, if you take away this gene that has this predisposition to suffering or low mood, whatever it may be, then you'll take away my artistic expression, or because usually good artists are of the least happy in society.
Yes, I mean, this is the argument that great art and great literature is often born of immense suffering, and frequently that is true. But one of the many, many astonishing aspects of the Transformer revolution is that AI can now produce art that surpasses anything in the Louvre. I mean, some artists would push back at this, but yeah, I mean, I love generative art. I spend a lot of time fiddling around. You can choose your own prompts. You can create your own vision of paradise, whether perfect beauty of a human or perfect beauty in nature. It's true that suffering can be instructive, both in the arts and in the rest of life. But the question to ask is not whether suffering, negative experience can sometimes be instructive, but have an information signaling role. The question to ask is whether it is computationally, functionally indispensable. And generative AI shows that it isn't. That, this vast revolution of artificial intelligence, we are creating intelligent systems without suffering, showing that essentially suffering is redundant. It's unnecessary, that essentially natural selection has used mental and physical pain to help us leave more copies of our genes in the ancestral environment, but there are more civilized signaling systems we can use. Essentially, we can choose between, and these choices aren't mutually exclusive, a pleasure super pleasure axis and or smart neuroprostheses. But essentially, anything that today involves suffering can be done via systems that don't involve any unpleasant experience at all.
So, are you saying that we don't need suffering in order to create great art because we've got AI that can do it for us? Or are you saying that AI is showing us that it can create art without suffering, therefore future humans will be able to,
Yes.
even if they've had the if they've even if they are blissed out?
But
Blissful, sorry.
blissful, not blissed out. I should stress too, and here, that it will be possible to use neuroscanning to identify the molecular signature of aesthetic experience of beauty and purify, enhance, overexpress this molecular basis of aesthetic experience. And if we want to, we can create aesthetic experiences of beauty that are far richer and more beautiful than anything even physiologically possible today. So if we want to, we can not merely create life that is blissful, animated by gradients of bliss, we can also ensure that everyday life is superhumanly beautiful too. So yeah, this is taking art aesthetic experience to an entirely new level. Wow.
You mentioned earlier that you were lifelong celibate. Is that by choice?
Yes, I'm a crashing prude. Yeah, in some ways, I'm incredibly British. In principle, I'm the ultimate liberated males. I favour people who know who who enjoy the pleasures of the flesh, and it will be possible to use technology to create, superhuman sensuality too. But yeah, I'm personally celibate. I don't think anyone has ever heard me swear. I'm buttoned up British person of my generation. Not that everyone of my generation was like me, but you can probably tell from various mannerisms and turns of phrase that I am very British and I speak the King's English.
And was that a conscious choice? Is that a philosophical kind of way of life, or is it just how life has happened?
Well, as I said, I'm very prudish. I mean, this is true. If you look at some of the philosophers of hedonism, no orgy was ever graced by the body of John Stuart Mill or anything, anything like that. No, I mean, I don't aim to be deliberately mysterious or anything, but essentially I try to focus on the ideas rather than anything that is personal or idiosyncratic to me. Starting from the fact that sadly my body avatar doesn't evoke the post-human paradise I talk about. No, I mean I'm happy to give you a kind of few personal anecdotes of me or my family history, but I'm much more relaxed, focusing on the ideas, which I think are what matters.
Mm. I just think it's always interesting, to find out why people have chosen the path that they have,
Mhm.
and the ideas. Where do those ideas come from? I think it allows us to have a holistic picture, but also I'm more than happy to stay focused on the ideas if that's how you prefer. Let's talk about MDMA.
Mhm.
What is your experience with what's the what's the scientific name for it? Methyl something or other?
Let's just call it MDMA or ecstasy. Yes, MDMA gave me an insight into what mental health could be like. It was a revelation to me. Unlike psychedelics, MDMA can give you this sense of authentic sense. This is the real me. To love oneself, to love others, breakdown of all the inhibitions. I can, spontaneously go up and give strangers a hug, which I certainly wouldn't do in my normal default state of consciousness. Sadly, MDMA-like consciousness is not sustainable. It kicks into gear the negative feedback mechanisms of the hedonic treadmill. Um, 48 hours later, there can be a serotonin dip and a crash, and over the subsequent week, a kind of all the opposite of all the wonderful experiences, one had while on the drug itself. After taking it last century, I was very much of the inclination that yes, what we need is more love, more empathy, devising compounds, and then genetically engineering states of MDMA-like empathy, empathetic love and understanding. But, and this is the complication, we need more than just more empathy. We also need the capacity to hypersystematize, autistic hypersystematization. It's no good simply being compassionate for a cat or compassionate for a mouse. After all, cats harm mice. We need to, take this broader view of the biosphere. Love, empathy, compassion are not enough. We need to hypersystematize.
What about psychedelics?
Um, Yes, if I'm choosing my words carefully here, to understand consciousness, which ultimately is all one ever knows, albeit not under that description quite frequently, one needs to pursue the experimental method. And yet the experimental method is profoundly dangerous because our dark Darwinian minds essentially, psychedelics can intensify experience, whether good or bad. And if you have a good trip, it can be a mystical epiphany. But if you have a bad trip, it can be beyond what now is beyond your worst nightmares. In terms of the actual content of psychedelic trips. Essentially, I think billions of alien state spaces of consciousness, as different as waking from dreaming consciousness, await discovery and exploration. But it will only be safe to do so once we have got our reward circuitry sorted out and we can physiologically prevent, make impossible all experience below hedonic zero. And once we have done this, we can ensure that any form of exploration is inherently blissful. I should add that I don't think psychedelics offer an instant route to even a good trip to enlightenment because these state spaces are completely beyond our everyday conceptual scheme. Therefore, we don't have any language to understand what is going on. And even if, one does come up with language, it would be unintelligible to a drug naive person. And if one listens to the accounts of psychedelic experiences of people who do take psychedelics, either they tend to babble nonsense or they talk about the ineffable, the inexpressible, the inconceivable. And it would be very natural if you're completely drug naive just to dismiss psychedelia as worthless. I mean, sure, someone has weird experiences, but so what? However, I mean, I give I sometimes offer this parable of a tribe of blind rationalists. Imagine in this tribe of blind rationalists, someone discovers a particular drug that induces what we would call visual experiences. It doesn't create any kind of visual sensory apparatus. It just creates these weird visual experiences. And the person in this tribe of blind rationalists who discovers this drug is convinced he's made an absolutely momentous discovery, and he's right. But when he tries to explain what he's undergoing, these strange visual, what we would call visual experiences, to the elders of the tribe, and he says that these experiences are ineffable, inexpressible, and so forth. Well, what do the elders of the tribe think? I mean, this guy, he's not going on to creating uh, great kind of auditory masterpieces or anything. He spends his time just taking this drug that induces these weird experiences. So what? Now, as outsiders, we can say that this guy has made a momentous discovery, but how can he communicate it to the elders of the tribe except by trying to persuade them to take the drug themselves? And they may be very disinclined to do so because it seems to induce these psychotic states, this psychotic babbling. I don't know if that thought experiment makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I've understood it correctly, because I have experimented with numerous things over the years. Interesting enough, the last time I drank alcohol was 3 years today. But I will still, MDMA psychedelics is something I will still partake in. Not that I would recommend it to anyone listening. Obviously, it is illegal. And I think sometimes, I'll find myself talking about a mystical experience I've had and trying to explain it to someone, and it's precisely that sort of example whereby unless you've experienced it yourself, you just go, oh, look at that hippie cliche guy talking about oneness or whatever, or everything being connected. You must be hallucinating. He must be hallucinating. And then if you have one of those journeys yourself, it is a form of hallucination, but at the same time, it feels extremely real. Does that make sense?
Yes, one sense of what is real is frequently a function of the intensity of the experience, and though some aspects of psychedelics are completely beyond our conceptual scheme, when one says that they are generically, typically more intense, I would say that is a fairly general description. And yeah, more intense equals crudely more real.
I think for me, it kind of makes me think about the sort of like the illusoriness of being, in terms of what is inverted commas real, because everything is kind of a projection, isn't it, of your internal interpretation of the information that's been fed into your retina, etc., and how your brain is going to process it. And then you kind of delve into this world, and then and you go, well, is this real? Or like, I'm going very abstract at this point, but these conversations tend to make me start to dip my toe back into that world of mysticism.
Yes, well, I think what naive realists conceive as the mind-independent world, each of us perceiving the local environment. Actually, each of us is running an egocentric world simulation. And when you're awake rather than dreaming, the contents of your world simulation are typically tightly selected by inputs from the hypothetical external environment. But you don't actually access the world beyond your transcendental skull. And when taking psychedelics, heavy doses of psychedelics, the power of selection pressure of external inputs is sometimes minimized. And so it is possible sometimes on high doses of LSD to hallucinate, or on various dissociatives to have out-of-body experiences. And if you're a naive realist and you're having an out-of-body experience, it must be very natural to think that the scientific world picture is false. But yeah, in spite of everything I've said, in one sense, I'm fairly orthodox. I'm a physicalist. I think the world is exhaustively described by the equations of physics. But yeah, in one sense, science is profoundly ignorant that materialism does not explain consciousness, and I'm technically what is known as provisionally at any rate, a non-materialist physicalist. I think that the intrinsic nature of the physical, the fire in the equations may well be experienced, but I have no account of why the particular solutions to the equations encode the particular values of experience they do.
Are you an atheist?
Yes, I mean, I don't go around saying I'm an atheist any more than I say that I don't believe in the Greek gods. Spirituality does not loom large in my life. Having said that, just as I alluded earlier to the possibility of identifying the molecular signature of pure beauty, likewise, it should be possible to identify the molecular signatures of spiritual experience. Optionally, at any rate, we'll be able to enrich, purify, amplify them, and it will be possible to go through one's life enraptured in super spiritual states that are far richer than anyone alive today can undergo or imagine. What these hyper spiritual states actually mean in any transcendent sense, well, as I said, I'm personally skeptical. I think, yeah, as I said, I'm a physicalist, but perhaps I'm wrong.
A physicalist. Would you describe yourself as a physicalist or a physicist rather than a philosopher, or is there much? What is the tension between those definitions?
Well, most practicing scientists, physicists are pretty scornful of philosophy and philosophers, and I can understand that because most philosophers don't take the trouble to steep themselves in physics, do the kind of mathematical groundwork necessary. But all science is up to its neck in philosophical assumptions, and the penalty of disavowing philosophy isn't to overcome it, but to give bad philosophical assumptions a free pass. Although, yeah, Wikipedia describes me as a philosopher, I try to be a scientifically literate philosopher. I should probably, sorry for the jargon, I should probably define a few terms. A materialist thinks that the essence of the world is essentially insentient matter and energy. And sometimes the term physicalist is just used interchangeably with materialist. But no, by describing oneself as a physicalist, one is saying that only the physical is real and all the special sciences, chemistry, biology, and so forth, ultimately reduce to physics. However, what is the intrinsic nature of the physical, the fire in the equations? If one makes a very plausible assumption that the fire in the equations, the essence of the physical, is non-experiential, then we face the hard problem, the notorious explanatory gap. How do you derive consciousness from the non-conscious? My working assumption is that the nature of the world's fundamental quantum fields doesn't differ inside and outside the head. And what makes you and other human and non-human animal minds special isn't consciousness per se, but the way consciousness is phenomenally bound into virtual worlds of experience like the one you're experiencing right now. So yes, a slightly different take on, I mean, most physicalists are pretty close to materialists. I'm not a materialist, but I do believe that the world is mathematically exhaustively described by the equations of physics. And if someone comes up with a theory that is inconsistent with the standard model in physics, well, they're probably wrong. So this mixture of the very conservative and the pretty radical.
If you had to describe your own hedonic set point, where would you map that on a 1 to 10?
Well, I find it useful to sort of -10 to 0 to +10 as the hedonic range of Darwinian life. And I anticipate future civilizations. Imagine a +30 to a +50, or a +70 to 100, or even a +90 to a +100. So I don't think we can even glimpse how sublime life in future is going to be. But my hedonic set point, I said I wouldn't enter into too many personal details, but yes, unfortunately, from teenage years onwards, I experienced melancholic depression. I found that existing treatments didn't work. I went doctor shopping. I explored different agents. Back in 1995, I stumbled on, after many false starts, selegiline, which is a selective monoamine oxidase type B inhibitor. And since 1995, I have taken 10 milligrams of selegiline each day. Selegiline boosts dopamine and phenylethylamine function. I subsequently discovered and took from around, I don't know, about 2002, ammoneptin, dopamine reuptake inhibitor. And I was able, yes, to claw my way out of melancholic depression. But my own hedonic set point, maybe -3, -4. Sometimes I could go a little bit, above hedonic 0, but mostly it was below hedonic 0. Yes, I've been very mindful of the extent to which, futurists, when they're pronouncing on the future of life, sentience, and civilization, they're really describing their own autobiographical journey. And given that my life, personal existence, very much focused on ratcheting up my hedonic set point, is it really sane? Is it really sensible to generalize my personal experience to the whole of sentience? Because suffering doesn't loom large in everyone's life, as you know. I mean, some people, they have a very different narrative, but that was my narrative. Sadly, I've never been able to, wake up in the morning, good to be alive. So I've only very incompletely conquered anhedonia. I've recently added gabapentin to my regimen, which, if I seem to be in a slightly altered state of consciousness from any previous videos you've seen, it's because I'm currently exploring gabapentin. So triple ammoneptin, selegiline, and gabapentin. Probably no one else is on this regimen. But yes, so I mean, that's my personal journey. I haven't generally this century, at any rate, explored any particular kind of psychedelics. My mind is too dark to do so. Nor have I been very impressed by existing drugs. The failure of selective kappa opioid antagonists was a big disappointment. I'm still waiting for the elusive, breakthrough to pharmacological soma. It would be wonderful if somatic gene therapy could ratchet up hedonic set points. And though I have speculated on the future, it isn't yet routinely possible. So in terms of my own journey, well, I don't know. But back to your original question, yes, sadly, my hedonic set point is below 0.
And how would you define 0?
Sorry, I used too much jargon. Hedonic 0 is simply emotionally neutral experience that is neither good nor bad. This what Sidgwick called this kind of the natural watershed. And my vision of the future, to make it clear, is essentially eliminating all experience below hedonic zero. And yeah.
Would you say that apathy would be zero, or would be below zero?
One would need to define precisely what apathy is. If apathy is simply just an absence,
Numbness.
of numbness, but if the apathy takes the form of an unpleasant boredom, then it's below hedonic zero. And there are other complications too, so-called mixed states that, bittersweet or sadomasochism or nostalgia, states that aren't either pure pleasure or pure pain. But in the long run, I can't see any reason to keep states below hedonic zero at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like the start of this year, I think I posted about it on my Instagram as well, and I said, happy but sad, strong but weak, motivated but lazy, and I found myself having a real mix of those states and finding it hard to define how I was feeling. Interestingly enough, and then it seemed to equalize into much more of that apathy. So I was experiencing both high and low, and then it kind of leveled out into a little bit of a middle ground.
Crudely speaking, if you want to increase motivation, to overcome apathy, increase motivation, opt for dopaminergics. One problem, of course, though, with dopaminergics is their abuse potential, something like cocaine or amphetamines, which can be followed by a crash. But in terms of what we should,
That pleasure pain sort of seesaw.
what we should be aiming for, it seems that bliss, happiness, and motivation are dissociable, and that we can ratchet up bliss, we can ratchet up motivation too, but we're going to be able to choose what level of motivation and what level of bliss we have. It's possible to imagine a future civilization of lotus eaters who are blissful, but they're not motivated to do anything. But we can also imagine a future civilization of humans, transhumans who are blissful, but they are also hyper motivated to an extent that we can't even imagine today. So, different visions of the future. Will they be of serene, tranquil bliss or hyper motivation? Dopamine gives you this sense of things to be done.
David, thank you very much. This has been really fascinating. I've enjoyed listening to you speak about your work, and I don't think I've ever met anyone with such a unique view of the world, and I really thank you for sharing that with us.
Well,
is there anything that we've not discussed today, or anything that you're working on that you'd like to talk about?
Well, although today most people would think this sounds pretty crazy, I would hope one day it will just be robust common sense. That, in a future era and underpinned by gradients of intelligent bliss, I think, it'll just seem transparently obvious that life should be like this. I mean, sometimes one hears this distinction between happiness and meaning, but in a world underpinned by gradients of bliss, essentially life will seem inherently super meaningful, super significant by its very nature. In terms of drawing strands together, yes, I mean, unfortunately, temperamentally, I'm a philosopher. I would love to say to anyone listening, hey, would you like to get involved in the project? I do. There is a Hedonistic Imperative Facebook group. I spend too much time on X. My Motherload website is hedweb.com, hedweb.com, hedweb.com. And yes, you'll there find state-of-the-art web design 1996, but nonetheless, I continue to put out these ideas. But yes, if you'd like to get involved, and there is a small little abolitionist ecosystem, yeah, please do get in contact. And sorry, as you probably gathered from our discussion, quite a few loose ends, shall we say? But no, Jason, very much appreciated inviting me on your show.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, and I will put all of those links in the show notes. And yeah, loose ends. This is what we're about. It's all about loose ends. You're not going to define everything in a 90-minute conversation, are you? So it's been a really interesting discussion. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Jason.